The old man pressed his ear against the frozen metal block and whispered, "You're not dead. You just stopped trusting us." It was 36 hours before the record blizzard would hit Montana, and the only snowplow capable of keeping the mountain pass open had just died in the municipal yard. The town council was ready to auction it off as scrap, but Walt McCready, 73 years old with grease under his fingernails and 50 years of diesel engines in his bones, saw something they didn't. On the other side of the chain-link fence, a young woman raised her phone and said, "If you try to fix it, I'll help, and I'll show the whole town." What happened next would prove that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to whether you believe a machine has given up or if it's just waiting for someone who remembers how to listen. The Oshkosh 1972 snowplow sat in the municipal yard like a wounded beast, its orange paint faded to the color of rust and old memories. Ray Hutchins turned the key one more time, and the engine coughed, a wet, desperate sound that any mechanic would recognize as the death rattle of a machine that had given everything it had. "Come on, you piece of—" Ray muttered, pumping the accelerator. The engine turned over once, twice, then nothing but the clicking of a starter that refused to catch. Blue smoke drifted from the exhaust stack, carrying with it the smell of burned oil and broken dreams. From across the street, Walt McCready watched through the window of Murphy's Diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 73, Walt had the kind of face that spoke of decades spent under the hoods of trucks, bulldozers, and farming equipment, deep lines carved by years of squinting at engine parts, grey stubble that never quite stayed shaved, and eyes that could diagnose a mechanical problem just by listening to the sound it made. "That Cummins is singing its swan song," said Ellie Murphy, sliding into the booth across from him. She was the kind of woman who'd been running the diner since before half the town was born, with silver hair always pulled back in a practical bun and an apron that had seen more coffee stains than a barista's worst nightmare. "Ray's been trying to start it for 20 minutes. Walt nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the orange hulk in the yard. 12-valve Cummins. Good engine. They don't make 'em like that anymore. Don't matter how good it is if it won't run," Ellie said, refilling his cup without asking. "Council meeting's at 7 tonight. Trent Hollis is pushing hard for that new contract with Morrison Equipment." The mention of Trent's name made Walt's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Trent Hollis was the kind of man who wore expensive suits to municipal meetings and had a smile that belonged in a toothpaste commercial. He'd been the town's public works coordinator for 3 years, and in that time he'd managed to convince the council that everything they owned was either outdated, dangerous, or both. "Morrison Equipment," Walt repeated, the words tasting sour in his mouth. "What do they know about Montana winters?" "They know about making money," Ellie said, "and Trent knows about getting his cut." Outside, Ray had given up on the starter and was now standing beside the plow with his hands on his hips, staring at it like he was trying to will it back to life. At 45, Ray Hutchins had been the town's head of maintenance for 8 years, and he was the kind of guy who could fix just about anything with duct tape, WD-40, and pure, stubborn determination. But this was beyond his wheelhouse, and everyone knew it. The diner bell chimed as the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air, and Kyle Morrison, Trent's nephew and the town's newest hire. Kyle was fresh out of trade school with certificates in diesel mechanics and an attitude that suggested he thought everyone over 50 was stuck in the Stone Age. "That old piece of junk finally gave up the ghost, huh?" Kyle said, sliding into a stool at the counter and nodding toward the window. "I told Uncle Trent it was a waste of time trying to keep it running." Walt's grip on his coffee cup tightened. "That old piece of junk has been keeping this road clear for 30 years. Kyle turned to look at him, and Walt could see the condescension in his eyes, the look of a young man who thought age was the same thing as irrelevance. "Yeah, well, times change, old man. These new plows have GPS tracking, computer diagnostics, automated salt distribution. That dinosaur out there doesn't even have a decent heater. It's got heart, Walt said quietly. Heart doesn't clear snow, Kyle shot back, and it sure doesn't pass safety inspections. Ellie set down Kyle's coffee with just a little more force than necessary. Safety inspections that conveniently started failing right after Trent took over the department. Now hold on, Kyle started, but Walt was already standing up, tossing a $5 bill on the table. Where you going, Walt? Ellie asked. Walt looked out the window one more time, watching Ray kick the front tire of the Plow in frustration. Thought I might take a listen. He walked out of the diner and across the street, his work boots crunching on the layer of frost that had already begun to form on the asphalt. The weather service was calling for a temperature drop of 40 degrees by tomorrow night, with wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour. If that road didn't get cleared, people would be trapped, and if someone needed to get to the hospital, Walt had learned a long time ago not to think about the ifs. Ray looked up as Walt approached the chain-link fence that surrounded the municipal yard. Walt, didn't see you there? Engine troubles? Ray laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. Engine troubles? Hell, this thing's got more problems than a divorce lawyer's client list. Won't turn over, smokes like a chimney when it does run, and yesterday I found coolant in the oil pan. Walt studied the machine through the fence. The Oshkosh was a beast, 15 feet long, 8 feet wide, with a plow blade that could move mountains of snow and a chassis built to handle punishment that would kill a modern truck. But it was also old, neglected, and running on borrowed time. Mind if I take a look? Walt asked. Ray glanced around nervously. I don't know, Walt. Trent said nobody's supposed to work on it except Kyle, and he's already declared it DOA. I'm not going to work on it, Walt said. Just want to listen. Ray hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and unlocked the gate. Knock yourself out. But the council meeting's in 4 hours, and Trent's got Morrison's contract ready to sign. Walt walked slowly around the Plow, his trained eye taking in details that most people would miss. The exhaust stack was stained with white residue, a sign of coolant getting into the combustion chamber. The hydraulic lines for the plow blade were weeping fluid, but that was normal for a machine this age. The real story was in the engine compartment. He popped the hood and leaned in close, breathing in the familiar smell of diesel fuel, motor oil, and metal that had been worked hard for decades. This was his language, the vocabulary of pistons and valves, fuel pumps and injectors. He'd been speaking it since he was 16 years old. That's when he heard the footsteps behind him. You know, most people would call what you're doing trespassing. Walt turned to see a young woman standing about 10 feet away, holding a smartphone in her hands. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of clothes that suggested she worked somewhere that required steel-toed boots. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent and focused on him, with an intensity that made Walt think she was evaluating him the same way he evaluated engines. Most people would be right, Walt said. You calling the cops? The woman smiled. Depends. You planning to steal it? Wouldn't know where to fence a stolen snow plow. Good point. She stepped closer, extending her hand. Maya Torres. I work at the county recorder's office. Been watching this whole drama play out for weeks. Walt shook her hand, noting the calluses that suggested she knew her way around manual labor. Walt McCready. Used to run the garage down on 2nd Street. Used to? Walt's expression darkened slightly. Long story. Maya nodded toward the plow. What do you think? Is it really dead? Walt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the engine like a doctor examining a patient. Finally, he reached into the engine compartment and placed his ear against the engine block, just above where the number 6 cylinder would be. What are you doing? Maya asked. Listening, Walt said. He stayed that way for nearly a minute, his eyes closed in concentration. When he finally straightened up, there was something different in his expression, a spark of recognition that hadn't been there before. Well? Maya asked. Walt looked at her, then at the engine, then back at her. "You know anything about diesel engines?" "I know they're supposed to run." "This one wants to run," Walt said. "It's trying to tell us what's wrong, but nobody's listening." Maya raised her phone. "If you try to fix it, I'll help. And I'll show the whole town." Walt stared at her for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Maya said, "sometimes the best stories are about things everybody else has given up on." The town hall was packed tighter than a Sunday service, with folding chairs arranged in crooked rows and the smell of coffee and nervous sweat hanging in the air. Walt sat in the back, his flannel shirt and work boots making him stand out among the business suits and pressed khakis that filled the front rows. Trent Hollis stood at the podium like a preacher about to deliver salvation, his silver hair perfectly styled and his smile bright enough to power the building. Behind him, a projection screen showed glossy photos of modern snowplows, sleek yellow machines that looked more like spaceships than the workhorses Walt remembered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trent began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who'd never had grease under his fingernails, "we're here tonight to discuss the future of snow removal in our community. And frankly, it's time we stopped living in the past." He clicked a remote, and the screen changed to show a photo of the old Oshkosh, looking even more decrepit under the harsh fluorescent lights of the municipal garage. A murmur ran through the crowd. "This machine," Trent continued, "is 30 years old. It has no GPS, no computer diagnostics, no automated systems whatsoever. Worse than that, it's become a safety hazard. Our mechanic has declared it unsafe for operation." Kyle Morrison stood up from the front row, his trade school certificates practically glowing with newness. "That's right, Mr. Hollis. I ran a full diagnostic this afternoon. Engine compression is down 30%, the hydraulic system is leaking, and the electrical system is so outdated it doesn't even have proper ground fault protection." Walt felt his jaw clench. Diagnostic. The boy probably hadn't even popped the hood. "Furthermore," Kyle continued, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight, "the insurance company has informed us that they will no longer cover liability for equipment this old. If someone gets hurt because that antique breaks down, the town could be looking at a lawsuit that would bankrupt us." More murmurs, these ones worried. Walt could see the fear spreading through the room like smoke from a barn fire. These people trusted numbers and certificates and official-sounding words more than they trusted their own eyes. Mayor Patricia Henley, a woman in her 60s who'd been running the town for longer than most people had lived here, leaned forward in her seat. "What exactly are you proposing, Trent?" Trent's smile got wider. "Morrison Equipment has graciously offered to provide us with a brand new Cat 257D snow removal system. State-of-the-art technology, full warranty and financing that keeps our payments under budget." He clicked the remote again, and the screen filled with specifications and payment schedules that made Walt's head spin. But one number stood out, $180,000. "Now I know that sounds like a lot," Trent said, reading the room like a politician, "but when you consider the cost of constant repairs on the old machine, plus the liability risk, plus the inevitable breakdown that will leave our roads impassable during a storm, it's really the only fiscally responsible choice." Ray Hutchins raised his hand from the middle of the room. "What about parts? That Oshkosh has been running strong for 30 years. We know how to maintain it." "Ray," Trent said with the kind of patience you'd use with a slow child, "you just spent 6 hours today trying to start it. It didn't even turn over. Sometimes old engines need to be replaced," Kyle interrupted. "Look, I appreciate the nostalgia, but we're not running a museum here. We're trying to keep people safe." That's when Walt stood up. The room went quiet. Everyone in town knew Walt McCready, though most of them only knew the stories. How he'd kept every piece of equipment in the county running for 40 years. How he'd closed his garage after what happened with the Peterson boy. How he'd become something of a hermit, living alone in the house on Maple Street and only coming to town when he absolutely had to. "Walt," Mayor Henley said carefully, "did you have something to add?" Walt cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was gravelly from years of breathing exhaust fumes and metal dust, but it carried clearly through the room. "That boy didn't even look at the engine," he said, nodding toward Kyle. "Ran a computer diagnostic on a machine that was built before computers existed." Kyle's face flushed red. "I know how to diagnose an engine, old man." "Do you?" Walt asked. "Tell me what you found when you checked the fuel delivery system." The what?" "Fuel delivery system. Did you check the primary filter, the water separator, the injection pump timing?" Kyle's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "The diagnostic computer doesn't know how to listen to an engine breathe," Walt said. "Doesn't know how to feel for vibration in the block. Doesn't know how to read the story that metal tells when it's been worked hard for 30 years. Trent stepped back to the podium, his politician's smile slipping just a notch. "Walt, we appreciate your experience, but the fact remains that the machine won't start. Kyle is a certified diesel mechanic, and he's given us his professional opinion." "His professional opinion," Walt said, "is worth about as much as a chocolate teapot if he never got his hands dirty." The room erupted in nervous laughter, quickly hushed by Mayor Henley's gavel. "Gentlemen, please. Walt, do you have a specific concern about the proposed contract?" Walt looked around the room, seeing faces he'd known for decades. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband's tractor he'd kept running until the day Harold died. Jim Bradley, whose logging truck Walt had rebuilt from the ground up 3 times. People who used to trust his judgment back when his word meant something. "My concern," Walt said slowly, "is that you're about to spend $180,000 to replace something that might just need a $50 part and some attention." "And if you're wrong?" Trent asked, his voice sharp. "If that machine breaks down during the next storm and someone dies because the roads aren't clear, who's responsible then?" The words hit Walt like a physical blow. He could feel every eye in the room on him, could sense the unspoken memory that hung between them all like a ghost. The ambulance, the boy, the chain that snapped because he'd missed a hairline crack in a link. Walt started, then stopped. The weight of 30 years pressed down on him like a physical thing. That's when Maya Torres stood up from the side of the room. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I think there's something everyone should know before you sign that contract." Trent's smile faltered completely. "Miss, this is a town meeting. Are you a resident?" "County employee," Maya said, holding up a manila folder. "And I've been doing some research on Morrison Equipment and their maintenance contracts." She walked to the front of the room, her boots clicking on the worn linoleum. "Would you like to know what happened in Billings when they signed a similar contract 2 years ago?" The room was dead silent now. Trent's face had gone pale, and Kyle was staring at Maya like she'd grown a second head. "The new Plow worked great for 6 months, Maya continued, until the warranty ran out and the first major repair bill came in. Turns out those computer systems need specialized technicians, and the nearest authorized repair facility is in Denver. Billings ended up paying $40,000 in emergency service calls during their first winter, and their roads were closed for 3 days, waiting for parts." She opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "I've got the invoices right here if anyone's interested." Trent found his voice. That's completely different situation. Our contract has built-in maintenance." "For the first year," Maya interrupted. "After that, you're at the mercy of whatever Morrison wants to charge. And according to these documents from the county courthouse, Morrison Equipment has been padding their maintenance bills by about 30% over market rate." The room exploded into conversation. Mayor Henley banged her gavel repeatedly, but it took nearly a minute to restore order. "Now see here," Trent said, his composure finally cracking. "These accusations are completely unfounded." "They're not accusations," Maya said calmly. "They're public records, available to anyone who knows where to look." Walt found himself staring at this young woman, who'd appeared out of nowhere to fight a battle he'd been too scared to take on himself. She met his eyes across the room and gave him a slight nod, as if to say, "Your turn." Walt took a deep breath. "Give me 3 days," he said. The room went quiet again. "3 days to prove that engine will run," Walt continued. "If I can't get it started and running smooth by Sunday, you sign whatever contract you want." Mayor Henley leaned forward. "Walt, are you sure about this? If you're wrong—" "If I'm wrong," Walt said, "you haven't lost anything but 3 days. But if I'm right, you'll save the town enough money to fix the roof on the fire station and maybe even replace those streetlights that have been flickering since Clinton was president." Trent's face was red now. "This is ridiculous. We're talking about people's safety. We're talking about giving a machine a fair chance before we scrap it," Walt said. "Something that used to matter in this town." Mayor Henley looked around the room, reading the faces of her constituents. All in favor of giving Walt 3 days to attempt repairs. Hands went up throughout the room, not all of them, but enough. "Motion carries," the mayor said. "Walt, you've got until Sunday, but I want it understood. If that machine isn't running safely by then, we sign the Morrison contract immediately." As the meeting broke up, Walt found himself surrounded by people shaking his hand and wishing him luck. But all he could think about was the weight of expectation pressing down on him, and the fact that he hadn't actually worked on an engine in years. Maya appeared at his elbow as the crowd thinned out. "You realize you just painted yourself into a corner," she said. Walt nodded grimly. "Wouldn't be the first time." "Good thing you've got help," Maya said, holding up her phone, "because this story's just getting started." Walt's garage had been closed for 7 years, but it still smelled like motor oil and possibility. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight that streamed through grimy windows, illuminating workbenches covered in tools that hadn't moved since the day he'd locked the doors and walked away. Maya stood in the doorway, taking it all in. The hydraulic lift that dominated the center of the space, the pegboard walls lined with wrenches and sockets arranged with military precision, the rolling toolboxes that probably contained more automotive knowledge than most modern repair shops. "Jesus," she breathed, "this place is like a time capsule." Walt flipped on the overhead lights, fluorescent tubes flickering to life with the hum of old ballasts. "I haven't had much reason to come in here," he said, running his fingers along the edge of a workbench. "Not since—" He trailed off, but Maya had done her research. She knew about the Peterson boy, 16 years old, driving his dad's pickup when the tailgate chain snapped on Highway 9. The truck had rolled 3 times. By the time the ambulance reached the scene, it was too late. The chain had been one Walt had repaired 6 months earlier. A hairline crack in one of the links. Invisible to the naked eye, but fatal under load. The kind of failure that happens maybe once in 1,000 repairs. But when it does, it changes everything. "You know it wasn't your fault," Maya said quietly. Walt's jaw tightened. "County coroner didn't see it that way. Neither did the boy's father. Neither did I." He walked to the back corner of the garage, where a tarp covered something large and angular. With a sharp tug, he pulled the covering away, revealing a collection of diesel diagnostic equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Compression gauge," he said, pointing to each instrument in turn. "Cylinder leak-down tester, fuel pressure gauge, injector pop tester." He picked up a long, thin metal rod. "And this, probably the most important tool in the whole damn garage." "What is it?" "Listening rod," Walt said. "Put one end against the engine block, the other against your ear, and you can hear things no computer will ever tell you. Valve chatter, bearing knock, the sound a piston makes when it's about to let go." Maya watched him handle the tools with the reverence of a priest preparing communion. "You really think you can fix it?" Walt was quiet for a long moment, staring at the diagnostic equipment. "I think that engine's got something to say. Whether I'm still good enough to hear it, that's the million-dollar question." They loaded the tools into the back of Maya's pickup, a battered Toyota that had seen better decades but still ran like a sewing machine. As they drove through town toward the municipal yard, Maya noticed how people stopped to watch them pass. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now everyone knew about Walt's 3-day deadline. "You know what I don't understand?" Maya said, navigating around a pothole that could swallow a small car. "If Trent's so hot to get this new contract signed, why not just let the old Plow die naturally? Why push so hard?" Walt had been wondering the same thing. "Money makes people do stupid things," he said. "But usually they're at least smart about being stupid." They pulled into the municipal yard to find Ray Hutchins waiting for them, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands and worry lines etched deep in his forehead. "Morning, Walt," Ray said. "Hell of a thing you signed up for." Hell of a thing we all signed up for," Walt replied, climbing out of the truck. "This storm hit Sunday night, right?" Ray nodded grimly. "Weather Service is calling it a 100-year event. Temperature's supposed to drop 40 degrees in 6 hours, winds up to 70 miles per hour, snow accumulation between 18 and 30 inches. Maya whistled low. "That's serious." "Serious enough to shut down the highway for a week if we can't keep it clear," Ray said. "And the nearest backup Plow is 2 counties over." Walt studied the Oshkosh in the grey morning light. It looked even more forlorn than it had the day before, like an old dog that knew its time was running out. But there was something about the way it sat, not defeated, just waiting. "Ray," Walt said, "I need you to tell me everything. When did it start acting up? What were the symptoms? And don't give me Kyle's computer diagnosis. Tell me what you felt, what you heard, what you smelled." "Autumn." Ray set down his coffee and leaned against the fence. "Started about 3 weeks ago. Engine would hesitate when you first started it in the morning, like it was thinking about whether it wanted to run. Then last week, I noticed white smoke coming out of the exhaust when it was idling." "White smoke," Walt repeated. "Not black, not blue, white. Like steam. And there was this smell, not burning oil, not raw diesel. Something else." Walt nodded, filing the information away. "What about performance, power loss, strange noises?" "It was down on power for sure. Used to push snow like it was angry at it. Last few weeks it was struggling with loads that shouldn't have challenged it at all." Maya had been listening intently, her phone out to record everything. "What about maintenance? When was the last time it was serviced?" Ray's expression darkened. "That's where things get interesting. Kyle took over maintenance about 2 months ago. Said the old system was too inefficient, brought in his own service schedule." "His own service schedule," Walt said. "Meaning what?" "Meaning he changed suppliers for everything. Oil, filters, diesel additives. Said he could get better prices through Morrison's preferred vendors." Walt felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Show me the maintenance records." Ray led them into the small office attached to the garage, a cramped space that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. He pulled out a filing cabinet and extracted a thick folder. "Here's everything from the last 6 months," he said, spreading the papers on a desk covered in ring stains and old invoices. Walt studied the records with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. Maya looked over his shoulder, trying to make sense of the technical jargon and part numbers. "Here," Walt said, pointing to an invoice dated 2 months earlier. "New fuel filters. But look at the part number." Maya squinted at the small print. "What am I looking at?" "Wrong filters," Walt said grimly. "These are for a 2010 Caterpillar, not a 1972 Cummins. The micron rating is completely different." Ray leaned in closer. "What does that mean?" "It means your fuel system has been trying to breathe through a straw for 2 months, Walt said. "But that's not the worst part." He flipped to another invoice. "Diesel fuel additive, premium anti-gel compound." He looked up at Ray. Did Kyle explain what this was for? Said it would help with cold weather performance, prevent fuel line freeze-up. Walt's expression was grim. Ray, this isn't anti-gel compound. Look at the chemical composition. Maya read over his shoulder. Polyethylene glycol microspheres. What the hell is that? Fuel economy additive, Walt said. Supposed to improve combustion efficiency in modern engines. But in an old mechanical injection system like this Cummins. He shook his head. It's like putting sand in the fuel lines. The pieces were starting to come together now, painting a picture that made Walt's blood pressure rise. Ray, I need to see that fuel tank, and I need to see it now. They walked back outside to the Plow, Walt carrying a small toolkit and wearing the expression of a man who was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. The fuel tank was mounted behind the cab, a 100-gallon steel rectangle that had probably held thousands of gallons of diesel over its lifetime. Walt climbed up on the Plow's running board and unscrewed the fuel cap. The smell hit him immediately. Not the clean, oily scent of diesel fuel, but something else. Something wrong. Maya, hand me that flashlight. He peered into the tank, the beam illuminating liquid that should have been clear amber, but instead looked cloudy, almost milky. Son of a bitch, Walt muttered. What is it? Maya asked. Walt climbed down from the Plow, his face dark with anger. That's not fuel contamination, he said. That's deliberate sabotage. Ray's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean someone has been systematically destroying this engine, Walt said. Wrong filters to restrict fuel flow, microsphere additives to cause injection pump wear, and now... He gestured toward the tank. Water in the fuel. Probably introduced through the tank vent during that light snow we had 3 nights ago. Maya was filming everything, her phone capturing Walt's diagnosis. Why would someone do this? Walt looked at her, then at Ray, then at the Plow that had been slowly poisoned over the course of months, because dead machines don't compete with new contracts. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made them all turn. A white pickup truck with Morrison Equipment logos on the sides was pulling into the yard, Kyle Morrison behind the wheel and Trent Hollis riding shotgun. "Gentlemen!" Trent called out as he climbed out of the truck, his politician smile firmly in place. "How's the diagnosis going?" Walt straightened up, and Maya could see the change in his posture, the way a man stands when he's preparing for a fight. "Diagnosis is complete," Walt said. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Kyle laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Don't tell me you actually think you can fix that piece of junk." "I think," Walt said carefully, "that someone's been working real hard to make sure it stays broken." The smile faded from Trent's face. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Walt." "It's a pretty serious situation," Walt replied. "But I suppose coincidences happen. Wrong filters, ordered by mistake. Fuel additives misidentified. Water just happening to get into the tank right before the biggest storm in 30 years. Trent and Kyle exchanged glances, and Maya caught it all on camera. "Well," Trent said after a moment, "I'm sure you'll figure it out. You've got..." He checked his watch. 46 hours left." As they drove away, Maya lowered her phone. "They know we're on to them." Walt nodded, his eyes following the white truck as it disappeared around the corner. "Which means they're going to try to stop us." "Gee, can they?" Walt looked at the poisoned Plow, then at the tools they'd brought, then at the young woman who'd somehow become his partner in this fight against time and corruption. "They can try," he said, "but they just made one hell of a mistake." "What's that?" Walt smiled for the first time in days, and it was not a pleasant expression. "They got me angry." The first thing Walt did was drain the fuel tank completely, every contaminated gallon flowing into steel drums that Ray had scrounged from the county maintenance shed. The liquid that came out looked like chocolate milk, a disgusting mixture of diesel fuel, water, and the microscopic spheres that had been slowly destroying the injection system. 40 gallons of waste, Walt muttered, watching the last of it drain through the tank's bottom valve. At $4 a gallon, that's $160 down the drain, plus whatever damage those microspheres did to the pump. Maya was documenting everything with her phone, but she was also learning. How do you flush a fuel system? Carefully, Walt said, climbing down from the plow with his clothes already stained dark with diesel. First, you disconnect every fuel line from the tank to the engine. Then you flush each section separately with clean diesel until it runs clear. The injection pump, that's going to be the real challenge. He opened his toolbox and pulled out what looked like a small medieval torture device, a collection of steel fittings, rubber hoses, and pressure gauges connected to a manual pump handle. Injection system pressure tester, Walt explained, seeing Maya's confused expression. Old school. You hook it up to the injection lines and manually pressurize the system to see where you've got problems. Ray had been watching from a distance, occasionally glancing toward the street as if he expected Trent and Kyle to come roaring back with reinforcements. Walt, I've got to ask, what if they're right? What if this thing really is too far gone? Walt paused in his work, his hands covered in fuel and grease, and looked at the engine with the intensity of a doctor examining a critical patient. Ray, you know what the difference is between an old engine and a dead engine? What? An old engine still wants to run. It might be tired, it might be hurt, but somewhere deep in the metal, there's still that spark that made it come alive the first day it rolled off the assembly line. He patted the engine block with something approaching affection. This old Cummins, she's not dead. She's just been poisoned. The process of cleaning the fuel system took the better part of the morning. Walt worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, disconnecting lines, flushing sections, testing pressures. Maya found herself fascinated by the ritual of it, the way Walt seemed to commune with the machine, listening to sounds that were apparently meaningful to him, but sounded like random noise to everyone else. There, he said finally, wiping his hands on an old rag that had probably been white sometime in the previous century. Fuel systems clean. Now comes the hard part. That was the easy part? Maya asked. That was the preparation, Walt corrected. Now we find out if those microspheres damage the injection pump beyond repair. He connected his pressure tester to the pump, working the handle to build pressure while watching the gauges with the intensity of a man defusing a bomb. The needle climbed steadily, 50 psi, 100, 150. Then it held. Well, I'll be damned, Walt breathed. Pump seals are still good. Whoever built this thing, built it to last. Maya felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Does that mean it'll run? It means it might run, Walt said. But we're not done yet. Ray, I need you to go to Murphy's Hardware and get me a quart of the heaviest gear oil they've got, a can of carburetor cleaner, and a pack of those foam air fresheners, the pine-scented ones. Ray looked confused. Air fresheners? Trust me, Walt said. And Maya, I need you to call that friend of yours at the county courthouse. I want to see every invoice Morrison Equipment has submitted to any municipality in the state for the last 2 years. As Ray drove off, Maya made her calls while Walt continued his methodical inspection of the Plow's systems. She watched him check hydraulic fluid levels, test electrical connections, and perform a dozen other small tasks that seemed insignificant individually, but clearly added up to something larger. You know, she said, ending her third phone call, I'm starting to understand why you closed your garage. Walt paused in his work. Yeah? Why's that? Because you don't just fix machines, Maya said. You bring them back from the dead, and that's a hell of a responsibility. Walt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. The Peterson boy. His name was Danny, 16 years old, honor roll student, quarterback on the junior varsity team. Had a scholarship lined up to Montana State. Maya waited, sensing that this was a story Walt had never told anyone. The chain that failed was one I'd repaired the previous spring, Walt continued. Hairline crack in the seventh link, invisible crack, the kind you can't see without X-ray equipment. But I should have replaced the whole chain instead of just welding the link. You couldn't have known. That's what everyone said, Walt interrupted. The coroner, the insurance company, even the boy's mother. No way you could have known, they said. These things happen, they said. He looked up at Maya, and she could see 30 years of guilt in his eyes. But I knew that chain was 40 years old. I knew it had been under stress its whole life. I should have erred on the side of caution. So you closed the garage. So I closed the garage, Walt confirmed. Because I realized that when you're responsible for keeping people's vehicles safe, one mistake can destroy everything. And I couldn't live with making another one. Maya was quiet for a moment, processing this confession. But you're here now. Yeah, Walt said. I'm here now. Ray returned with the supplies and Walt immediately got back to work. He poured the gear oil into the engine crankcase, explaining that the heavier viscosity would help seal worn rings and provide better lubrication for a cold start. The carburetor cleaner went into the air intake system to clean carbon deposits from the combustion chambers. The air fresheners, Maya learned, were for detecting vacuum leaks in the intake system. The pine scent would be drawn into any crack or loose connection, providing an olfactory roadmap to problems that might not be visible. Old mechanic's trick, Walt explained, hanging the little pine trees at strategic points around the engine. If you can smell Christmas trees when the engine's running, you've got an air leak. As the afternoon wore on, Walt's methodical approach began to reveal the full scope of the sabotage. The air filter had been replaced with one that was too restrictive, choking off the engine's air supply. The oil had been changed to a viscosity completely wrong for the engine's specifications. Even the coolant had been diluted with water, reducing its effectiveness and increasing the risk of freeze damage. This wasn't random, Walt said, holding up a receipt for the wrong oil filter. This was systematic. Someone knew exactly how to kill this engine slowly, making it look like natural wear and tear. Maya had been compiling her own evidence, phone records, invoices, maintenance schedules. I've got Morrison Equipment service records for 6 different municipalities. Want to guess how many of their emergency replacements happened right after they took over maintenance contracts? All of them? All of them. Billings, Missoula, Great Falls, same pattern every time. New maintenance contractor, mysterious equipment failures, convenient replacement contracts. Ray whistled low. How much money are we talking about? Over the last 3 years? About $2 million in equipment sales, plus ongoing maintenance contracts, Maya said. Not bad for a company that barely existed 5 years ago. Walt stood up, his back protesting after hours of bending over the engine. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of rust and old blood, and the temperature was dropping fast. They were down to 36 hours. Tomorrow morning, Walt said, we put it all back together and see if she'll run. But tonight, we make sure nobody comes back to finish the job. What do you mean? Ray asked. Walt pointed to the municipal garage's security system, a single camera pointed at the main entrance and a lock that looked like it hadn't been changed since the Carter administration. I mean, we set up some real security. Maya, how's your night vision? Better than average. Why? Walt smiled grimly. Because I've got a feeling our friends at Morrison Equipment aren't done with us yet. And when they come back, and they will come back, we're going to be ready for them. As they prepared to leave for the night, Walt took one last look at the Plow. Tomorrow would tell the story. Either the old Oshkosh would roar back to life, vindicated and ready to face the storm, or it would remain silent, and the town would sign its expensive contract with Morrison Equipment. You think it'll work? Maya asked, following his gaze. Walt placed his hand on the engine block, feeling the cold metal under his palm. Somewhere in that steel and iron was the heart of a machine that had served faithfully for 30 years. Tomorrow, they'd find out if that heart was still beating. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. "But I'll tell you this much. We're going to give her every chance she deserves." The phone call came at 2:47 a.m., jarring Maya awake from dreams filled with diesel engines and conspiracy theories. She fumbled for her cell phone, recognizing Walt's number on the display. "They came back," was all he said, but the exhaustion in his voice told her everything she needed to know. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the municipal yard with Walt and Ray, surveying damage that made her stomach clench with rage. Someone had been here, all right. Someone with a very specific agenda and a complete lack of subtlety. The fuel tank cap was off, and fresh snow had been shoveled directly into the tank opening. The battery cables had been cut. The air intake had been stuffed with rags. Most devastating of all, the oil drain plug had been removed, and 36 hours' worth of careful preparation had leaked out onto the frozen ground in a dark, viscous puddle. "Jesus Christ," Ray breathed, staring at the mess. "How did they get past the security system?" Walt held up a pair of wire cutters he'd found near the fence. "Same way they got past the lock on the gate. These people aren't interested in being subtle anymore." Maya was documenting everything with her phone, the camera flash illuminating the vandalism in harsh, stark detail. "This is evidence of criminal sabotage. We need to call the sheriff." "Sheriff's department is 40 minutes away on a good day," Walt said. "By the time they get here, process the scene, and file a report, we'll be out of time. Storm hits tonight." He walked around the Plow, assessing the damage with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining a trauma victim. "Ray, how much oil do we have in storage?" "Maybe 10 quarts of the right viscosity. Walt, even if we can clean out that fuel tank again and replace all the fluids, we're talking about another 8 hours of work. And that's assuming nothing else got damaged." Walt knelt beside the puddle of oil, dipping his finger into the black liquid and rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. "This oil's still warm," he said quietly, "which means they were here less than an hour ago." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They might still be watching. "Oh, they're watching," Walt said, standing up and brushing the oil off his hands. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Ellie Murphy's pickup truck pulled into the yard, followed by 3 more vehicles that Maya recognized from the town meeting. Within minutes, the municipal yard was filled with people. Shop owners, retired workers, the kinds of folks who understood the difference between honest work and corporate manipulation. "Word travels fast," Ellie said, climbing out of her truck with a thermos of coffee and a grim expression. "Jim Bradley called me around 3. Said he saw lights moving around over here. Figured you might need some backup." Jim Bradley himself stepped forward, a big man with hands scarred by 40 years of logging work. "Walt, me and the boys were talking. That Plow's been keeping our roads clear since before half these politicians were born. Seems to us like somebody's trying real hard to make sure it doesn't keep doing its job." "What are you saying, Jim?" Walt asked. "I'm saying we're not leaving," Jim replied. "Not until this mess gets sorted out one way or another." Maya watched in amazement as the small crowd organized itself with military efficiency. 2 men took positions at the yard's entrance, coffee cups in hand and eyes scanning the street. Others began helping Walt assess the damage, holding flashlights and fetching tools with the practiced ease of people who understood machinery. "This is incredible," she murmured to Walt as they worked to drain the contaminated fuel tank for the 2nd time in 2 days. "This is Montana," Walt corrected. "When people see something worth fighting for, they fight." The work went faster with help. By sunrise, they'd flushed the fuel system again, replaced the oil, and cleaned snow and debris from every opening they could find. Walt worked with renewed energy, as if the presence of these volunteers had reminded him why the fight mattered. "Maya," he said around 8 a.m., "I need you to do something for me." "Name it." I need you to call Channel 7 News in Billings. Tell them you've got a story about municipal corruption and equipment sabotage. Tell them if they want footage of the biggest snow plow resurrection in Montana history, they need to be here by noon. Maya stared at him. Are you sure? If this doesn't work... If this doesn't work, at least everyone will know why, Walt said, and maybe the next town won't get fooled the same way. By 10 a.m., the yard was packed with people. Word had spread through social media and local radio, and it seemed like half the county had decided to witness whatever was about to happen. Maya spotted the Channel 7 news van pulling up just as Trent Hollis and Kyle Morrison arrived in their white pickup truck. Trent's face was red with anger as he pushed through the crowd toward Walt. "This is completely unacceptable," he shouted. "You people are trespassing on municipal property." "We're citizens of this municipality," Jim Bradley replied calmly, "and we're watching our tax dollars at work." Kyle Morrison looked around at the crowd, his young face pale with something that might have been fear. "Uncle Trent, maybe you should shut up," Trent snapped, then immediately looked like he regretted it. The crowd had gone quiet, sensing drama. Maya stepped forward, her phone recording everything. "Mr. Hollis, would you care to comment on the sabotage that occurred here last night?" "Sabotage?" Trent's voice rose to a squeak. "That's a completely unfounded accusation." "Unfounded?" Walt straightened up from the engine compartment, holding a rag soaked with fresh oil. "Someone cut the battery cables, someone stuffed rags in the air intake, someone put snow in the fuel tank and drained the oil onto the ground." He looked directly at Kyle. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, son?" Kyle's face went from pale to green. I don't know what you're talking about." "Funny thing about oil," Walt continued conversationally. "When it's fresh out of an engine, it's got a very specific smell. And when someone tracks it on their boots," he pointed to Kyle's work boots, which showed dark stains around the soles, "well, that smell tends to linger." The crowd pressed closer, and Maya could see Kyle starting to panic. Trent grabbed his nephew's arm, but it was too late. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent damage," Kyle blurted out. "Just enough to make sure it wouldn't start. Nobody was supposed to get hurt." The yard erupted in angry voices. Trent tried to pull Kyle toward their truck, but Jim Bradley and two other men blocked their path. "I think you boys better stick around," Jim said quietly, "at least until the sheriff gets here." Maya was texting furiously on her phone. "Sheriff's department is 15 minutes out," she announced, "and I just sent all of this footage to the state attorney general's office." Walt turned back to the engine, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around him. "Ray, help me with these battery cables. We've got a plow to start." "Walt," Ray said quietly, "what if it doesn't work? What if they damage something we can't fix?" Walt paused, his hands on the battery terminals. Around them, the crowd had grown quiet again, sensing that this was the moment everything had been building toward. "Then we'll know we gave her every chance she deserved," Walt said. "But Ray..." "Yeah?" Walt smiled, and this time it was a good smile, full of confidence and 30 years of accumulated knowledge. "I can hear her breathing. She wants to run." He connected the last battery cable and walked to the cab. The driver's door opened with a squeal of protest, and Walt climbed behind the wheel. He adjusted the mirrors, checked the gauges, and placed his hands on the steering wheel with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. Then he turned the key. The starter motor engaged with a healthy whir. The engine turned over once, twice, and caught. The Cummins diesel roared to life with a sound like thunder, black smoke belching from the exhaust stack before clearing to a faint grey haze. The engine settled into a steady idle, every gauge showing readings in the normal range. The crowd erupted in cheers. Maya found herself crying without knowing why. Ray was grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery, and Walt McCready sat behind the wheel of a machine that had been declared dead, listening to the sound of resurrection. And finally, allowing himself to believe that some things are worth fighting for. By 6 p.m., the temperature had dropped 38 degrees in 4 hours. The wind was picking up, rattling the windows of Murphy's Diner, where half the town had gathered to watch the Weather Channel's increasingly dire predictions. Snow was already falling, light flakes that danced in the streetlights, but promised much worse to come. Walt sat at his usual booth, but tonight he wasn't alone. Maya sat across from him, her laptop open, still fielding calls from news stations as far away as Seattle. The story had gone viral. Small town fights corruption, old mechanic saves the day, vintage snowplow rises from the dead. It was the kind of feel-good narrative that people desperately needed in a world full of bad news. Channel 12 in Denver wants to do a live interview at 11, Maya said, scrolling through her emails. And someone from Good Morning America called about doing a follow-up piece. Walt shook his head. I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted that old plow to run. Well, mission accomplished, Ray said, sliding into the booth beside them. He'd just come from the municipal yard, where the Oshkosh was fueled, serviced, and ready for whatever the storm could throw at it. All fluids good, hydraulics tested, blade sharp enough to shave with. She's purring like a kitten. Through the diner window, they could see the sheriff's car pulling away from the courthouse. Kyle Morrison had been arrested on charges of criminal mischief and conspiracy to defraud. Trent Hollis was facing a county investigation that would likely end his political career and possibly land him in prison. Morrison Equipment's contracts across the state were being reviewed by the Attorney General's office. Justice, Maya said, watching the patrol car disappear into the swirling snow. It's a beautiful thing. But Walt was focused on something else, the weather outside and the challenge that lay ahead. The National Weather Service had upgraded their forecast twice in the past hour. What had started as a significant weather event was now being called a historic blizzard, with the potential to shut down transportation across 3 states. It's not over yet, he said quietly. That plow hasn't been tested under real conditions in months. And this storm... He gestured toward the window, where the snow was falling harder now, the flakes fat and heavy with moisture. This is going to push everything to the limit. Around 9 p.m., Mayor Henley arrived with Ray's official orders. Highway 9 was closing to all but emergency traffic at midnight. The state road department wanted the local access roads kept open as long as possible, but they were realistic about the conditions. Do what you can, the mayor said, shaking Walt's hand. But don't take any unnecessary risks. That machine might be running, but it's still 30 years old. Walt nodded, but Maya could see something in his eyes, a determination that went beyond simple duty. This wasn't just about keeping roads clear anymore. This was about proving that experience and craftsmanship and the kind of knowledge you could only get from 50 years of working with your hands still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by computers and contracts and corruption. At 11:30 p.m., Walt climbed into the cab of the Oshkosh for the second time that day. But this time was different. This time, the engine was warm and ready. The hydraulics were charged, and the blade was angled perfectly for maximum snow movement. Maya rode shotgun, her phone charged, and ready to document whatever happened next. Ray followed in the town's backup truck, a smaller plow that could handle side streets, while the Oshkosh tackled the main routes. The first test came immediately. 6 inches of snow had already accumulated, and more was falling at a rate that would challenge any equipment. But the old Oshkosh moved through it like it had been waiting 30 years for this moment. Listen to that engine, Walt said, downshifting as they approached the first steep grade out of town. Smooth as silk, no hesitation, no smoke, no loss of power. Maya was filming through the windshield, capturing footage of snow flying off the blade in massive white plumes. How fast are we going? 15 miles per hour. Walt replied. Any faster and we'd outrun our visibility. Any slower and we'd get buried. The radio crackled to life. "Walt, this is Ray. I'm having trouble with the backup plow. Engine's running rough and I'm losing hydraulic pressure on the blade." Walt keyed the microphone. "Can you make it back to town?" "Barely. Looks like you're on your own out there." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The backup plow was newer, better maintained, equipped with modern diagnostic systems. If it was failing in these conditions, what did that say about their chances? But Walt seemed unfazed. "Been working alone most of my life," he said. "Sometimes it's better that way." They worked through the night, methodically clearing each road in order of priority. The Oshkosh performed flawlessly, its old Cummins engine maintaining steady power even as the conditions worsened. Walt drove with the skill of someone who'd been doing this longer than Maya had been alive, reading the terrain through feel and instinct. Around 3 a.m., they got the call that would define everything. "Emergency traffic on Highway 9, the radio squawked. "Medical transport needs immediate access. Kidney transplant patient, critical condition." Maya looked at Walt. Highway 9 was the mountain pass, 12 miles of steep grades, hairpin turns, and exposure to wind that could knock a truck off the road. It was also completely impassable in current conditions. "Walt," she said quietly, "you don't have to do this. Nobody would blame you for..." "For what?" Walt interrupted. "For letting someone die because I was too scared to do my job." He turned the plow around and headed for Highway 9. The wind hit them like a physical force as soon as they left the shelter of the valley, gusts strong enough to rock the heavy plow, carrying snow horizontally across their path and reducing visibility to mere yards. Walt downshifted again, feeling his way up the mountain more by memory than sight. "This is insane," Maya breathed, watching the GPS on her phone lose signal as they climbed higher. "This is necessary," Walt corrected. "That ambulance is carrying more than just a patient. It's carrying someone's child, someone's future, someone's hope." The radio crackled again. "Plow unit, this is County Dispatch. Emergency transport is 20 minutes behind you. How's your progress?" Walt keyed the microphone. "Slow but steady. Roads passable behind us, but just barely. Tell that ambulance to take their time and keep their distance." Maya was documenting everything, but she was also watching Walt work. This wasn't just mechanical skill anymore. This was artistry. The way he read the road surface through the steering wheel, the way he adjusted the blade angle for maximum efficiency, the way he seemed to anticipate the plow's needs before the machine even knew it had them. "There," he said suddenly, pointing through the windshield to a faint glow in the distance. "Ambulance lights." Maya squinted but couldn't see anything except swirling snow. "How can you tell?" "Experience," Walt said simply, "and hope." They reached the summit just as dawn was breaking, the storm finally beginning to ease. Behind them, a clear corridor stretched down the mountain, 12 miles of road that had been impassable an hour earlier. And coming up that corridor, its emergency lights flashing like beacons of hope, was the ambulance carrying its precious cargo. Walt pulled the plow to the side and watched the medical transport pass, its driver giving them a thumbs up through the cab window. Maya was crying again, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "That's why we do this," Walt said quietly, watching the ambulance disappear toward the hospital. "Not for the politicians or the contractors or the bureaucrats, for moments like that." They drove back to town in comfortable silence, the old Oshkosh performing one final service as the sun rose over a landscape transformed by snow. The streets were clear, the roads were passable, and somewhere in a hospital a patient was getting a second chance at life. At the municipal yard, a crowd was waiting, the same people who'd stood vigil during the repairs, plus dozens more who'd heard about the night's heroics. They cheered as Walt parked the plow and shut down the engine, but he seemed more interested in checking fluid levels and inspecting the blade for damage. "Well?" Maya asked, as Walt climbed down from the cab. He walked around the plow one more time, running his hands over the fender and listening to the engine as it cooled. Finally, He smiled, the kind of smile that comes from a job well done and a promise kept. "She's ready for whatever comes next," he said. "And so am I." 6 months later, Walt McCready reopened his garage on 2nd Street. The sign outside read, "McCready and Associates Diesel Repair," with Maya Torres listed as a partner. The Oshkosh still runs the mountain roads, maintained by people who understand the difference between what's profitable and what's right. And on cold winter nights, when the snow is falling and the roads need clearing, you can still hear the sound of that old Cummins diesel echoing through the Montana mountains, a reminder that some things are built to last, if you just take the time to listen to what they're trying to tell you. If this story touched your heart and reminded you why craftsmanship, integrity, and standing up for what's right still matter, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with words or money, but with grease under your fingernails and the determination to never give up on something worth saving. We'll see you in the next story.